Chapter 1. The Enigmatic Invitation. The rain over London was not dramatic that morning. It was simply persistent. A thin grey veil that turned the Thames the colour of tarnished pewter. Hercule Poirot sat at the small table in his impeccably ordered flat, a cup of chocolate chord cooling beside him, and studied the single sheet of heavy cream paper that had arrived with the second post. The handwriting was aristocratic, impatient, and slightly tremulous, as though the pen had been held by someone unused to writing anything at all. Blackwood Manor, Wiltshire, the letterhead declared in severe copperplate. Below it, in hurried ink, "My dear Monsieur Poirot, I find myself in a situation of the gravest delicacy. A matter has arisen at Blackwood Manor that I dare not trust to the local constabulary. Indeed, I dare not trust it to anyone save yourself. I have followed your exploits with the closest attention, and believe only your singular talents can prevent a catastrophe. Come at once, I implore you. A motor car will meet the 3:15 from Paddington at Chippenham tomorrow, Friday. Burn this letter when you have read it. I remain, in desperate hope, Evelyn Blackwood Poirot." Turned the paper over twice, as though expecting a postscript to materialize on the reverse. There was none, only the faint scent of lavender water and something sharper beneath it, fear perhaps. He permitted himself the smallest of smiles. "Burn this letter," he murmured to the empty room. "Always they wish Poirot to burn the letter, and always Poirot preserves it. Paper, mon ami, is often more eloquent than the writer intends." He rose, walked to the window, and gazed down upon the glistening street. The little grey cells, already pleasantly stimulated, began their familiar dance. Blackwood. The name tugged at a distant memory. An old county family, much reduced in circumstances, yet clinging to a crumbling manor and a reputation older than the Reformation. There had been a scandal some 30 years earlier, something about a missing heir and a contested will. But the details escaped him. No matter, details would come. George, his valet, entered with the discretion of a well-trained shadow. "George, tomorrow we depart for the country. Pack for a stay of perhaps 1 week. The green wool waistcoat, I think, and the new cape with the astrakhan collar. Wiltshire in December is inhospitable even to the English." "Very good, sir," said George, betraying neither surprise nor curiosity. "Shall I inform Inspector Japp that you will be unavailable?" "Non, non." Poirot waved a dismissive hand. "Japp believes I spend my winters cultivating begonias in Torquay. Let him continue to believe it. The good inspector becomes agitated when Poirot solves murders without him." That evening Poirot dined lightly, sole meunière, a single parfait au citron, then retired to his study. He drew from a locked drawer a slim leather notebook in which he recorded invitations that interested him. Turning to a fresh page, he wrote in his neat continental hand, "Blackwood Manor. Lady Evelyn Blackwood. Tone, urgent, secretive, aristocratic dread. Motive for secrecy, unspecified but intense. Probability of murder, high. Probability of interesting murder, very high indeed." He closed the book, placed the letter carefully between its pages, and allowed himself a small sigh of satisfaction. At 2:30 the following afternoon, the train from Paddington drew into Chippenham Station with a hiss of steam and the smell of hot oil. Poirot descended, his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the wet platform, his moustache waxed to symmetrical perfection. A tall chauffeur in bottle-green livery stood beside a gleaming Daimler, holding a board that read simply, "Monsieur Poirot." "Lady Evelyn sends her compliments, sir," the man said, touching his cap. "She instructed me to bring you to the manor without delay." Poirot studied him for a moment. The chauffeur's face was weather-beaten, the eyes watchful. A countryman, but not simple. "You have been long in service at Blackwood Manor?" Poirot asked as they moved off. 23 years, sir, since I was a lad. And Lady Evelyn. She is much loved by the staff." The chauffeur's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the wheel. "She is the last of the true Blackwoods, sir. We'd do anything for her ladyship." "Anything," Poirot repeated softly. "C'est intéressant." They left the town behind and entered a landscape of low hills and bare trees. The light was already fading, though it was not yet 4 o'clock. After 20 minutes, the Daimler turned between stone pillars surmounted by weathered griffins, and began the long climb up a drive bordered by skeletal oaks. Blackwood Manor appeared suddenly, as though the hill had shrugged it into being. A severe Jacobean pile of dark red brick, its chimneys smoking against a sky the colour of wet slate. One wing was clearly derelict, windows blind with boards, ivy devouring the stone like a slow green tide. As the car crunched to a halt on the gravel, the great oak door opened. A woman stood framed in the rectangle of lamplight, tall, silver-haired, perhaps 65, dressed in black velvet that had seen better decades. Her face was handsome rather than beautiful, the bones strong beneath the pale skin. Only her eyes betrayed exhaustion and something close to terror. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending a gloved hand. "You came. I hardly dared hope." Poirot bowed over the hand with exquisite correctness. "Madame, when Hercule Poirot receives a summons such as yours, he does not hesitate. Though I confess, I am devoured by curiosity." Lady Evelyn's smile was thin and wintry. "You shall have your answers, I promise you. But not here on the doorstep. Come inside before the cold takes you." She led him across a stone-flagged hall, where suits of armour stood like mute sentinels. A fire roared, in an ingle nook large enough to roast an ox, but the warmth barely reached the corners. From somewhere deep in the house came the slow, deliberate tick-tock of a great clock. Poirot paused. "That is a magnificent timepiece." Lady Evelyn's expression flickered. "The grandfather clock in the long gallery. It has kept perfect time for 250 years. My husband used to say it was the heart of Blackwood Manor." Her voice dropped. "Lately, I have begun to wonder if it is not something darker." Before Poirot could question this, a young man appeared at the foot of the staircase. 25 perhaps, handsome in a sullen way, with untidy black hair and the sort of mouth that looked born to sneer. "Aunt Evelyn, the prodigal detective arrives at last," he drawled. "Do introduce me to the famous Monsieur Poirot." Lady Evelyn's lips tightened. "My nephew, Mr. Damien Blackwood. Damien, this is Hercule Poirot." The young man gave a mocking half-bow. "Enchanted. Tell me, monsieur, do you always answer cryptic letters from frightened old ladies, or are we a special case?" Poirot regarded him calmly. "I answer only those letters that promise to be interesting, monsieur. Your aunt's letter was extremely interesting." Damien opened his mouth for a retort, but Lady Evelyn cut across him. "Enough, Damien. Monsieur Poirot has had a long journey. Hawkins will show him to his room. We dine at 8. As Poirot followed the elderly butler up the sweeping staircase, he heard Damien's low laugh behind him, quickly stifled. At the landing, the butler paused. "If I may be so bold, sir," Hawkins murmured, "her ladyship has not slept properly in a fortnight. Whatever brings you here, we are glad of it." Poirot nodded. "Tell me, mon ami, this clock that ticks so loudly, does it ever strike the hour?" Hawkins hesitated. "It has not struck since Sir Reginald died, sir. 20 years ago, come January. The mechanism was damaged, they said, though some in the village swear it still chimes at midnight when certain things are about to happen." He looked embarrassed at his own words and hurried on. Poirot entered the guest chamber, oak-panelled, a vast four-poster, another fire crackling, and stood for a moment motionless. Then he removed his hat, smoothed the famous moustaches before the mirror, and addressed his reflection with satisfaction. "Eh bien, Hercule Poirot, you wished for an interesting murder. It seems you have arrived just in time to prevent one, or perhaps to solve one already committed." Far below in the long gallery, the great clock gave its steady, deliberate tick, tock, tick, as though counting down to something inevitable. Chapter 2. Arrival at the Shadowed Estate. Hercule Poirot descended the great staircase at precisely 7 minutes to 8, his patent leather shoes making no sound on the worn Persian runner. The house smelled of beeswax, damp stone, and something faintly metallic that he could not yet place. From the hall below rose the murmur of voices, and the occasional brittle laugh that dies the moment it is born. Hawkins met him at the foot of the stairs with the solemnity of an undertaker announcing the order of service. "Dinner is served in the crimson dining room, sir, if you would follow me." They passed beneath a minstrel's gallery black with age, and along a corridor lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to shift as one walked by. Poirot noted the progression: Elizabethan Blackwoods in ruffs and armour, Restoration rakes with periwigs and sneers, Regency dandies with cruel mouths, and then a sudden gap, 3 empty hooks where paintings had lately hung. Someone, he reflected, had been selling the family's ancestors. The crimson dining room deserved its name. The walls were hung with dark red damask that drank the candlelight. Above the chimney-piece glowered a vast oil of Sir Gervase Blackwood, 1673, clutching a sword and looking as though he would gladly use it on any guest who complained about the mutton. 7 people were already gathered around the long mahogany table. They turned as one when Poirot entered, and for a heartbeat the room held its breath. Lady Evelyn stood at the head, paler than before, a rope of pearls tight at her throat as though it were a noose she had chosen herself. "Everyone," she said, "this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot. He has kindly consented to spend a few days with us." A ripple of curiosity, suspicion, and, in one pair of eyes, outright alarm passed around the table. Poirot bowed with perfect urbanity. "I am enchanted. One meets so seldom an entire tableau of suspects all in one room. It saves considerable legwork." A nervous titter greeted this. Lady Evelyn's smile did not reach her eyes. "Let me present my family and guests." She moved clockwise. "Miss Clarissa Vale, my late husband's niece, and my companion these 10 years. A thin woman of about 40, with sandy hair drawn back so tightly it seemed to hurt, inclined her head. Her eyes were the colour of weak tea, and just as revealing. Colonel Frederick Bannister, my husband's oldest friend. The colonel was 70 if he was a day, red-faced, bristling white moustache, the sort of man who still believed the Empire could be saved by cold baths and a stiff whisky. He gave Poirot a soldierly nod. "Dr. Maurice Leland." A slight, bespectacled man in his mid-40s, with nervous fingers that toyed endlessly with a napkin ring. His smile was quick and apologetic. "Mrs. Beatrice Leland, his wife." Beatrice Leland was perhaps 35, strikingly beautiful in a hard lacquered way. Her gown was Paris, her diamonds real, and her expression one of perpetual boredom barely masked by good manners. "And you have already met my nephew Damien." Damien lounged at the far end, a cigarette burning between his fingers in defiance of convention. He raised his glass in ironic salute. "That leaves only Miss Sylvia Blackwood," Lady Evelyn concluded. From the shadows near the fireplace stepped a girl of 19 or 20. She was small, dark-haired, with enormous violet eyes that reminded Poirot of a wounded deer. She wore a simple black velvet dress that made her look younger than she was. "My late brother's daughter," Lady Evelyn added quietly. "She has been staying with us since, well, for some months now." Sylvia gave a shy curtsy. "How do you do, Monsieur Poirot?" "Superbly, mademoiselle, now that I behold such beauty in surroundings so Gothic." Damien snorted. "Really, aunt, you might have warned us you were importing a Frenchman to flirt with the women." "Damien," Lady Evelyn said, and the single word cracked like a whip. Dinner began. The food was indifferent. Overboiled turbot, mutton that had died of old age, but the tension was exquisite. Conversation limped along on topics of weather, the iniquities of death duties, and the impossibility of finding decent servants since the war. Beneath it all ran a current of watchfulness. Poirot ate sparingly and observed. Clarissa Vale hardly touched her plate. Her gaze kept drifting to Damien with something between fear and longing. Colonel Bannister drank steadily, his eyes bloodshot. Dr. Leland attempted small talk about criminology, then subsided when Poirot answered in leisurely French. Beatrice Leland smoked cigarette after cigarette, exhaling through her nose like a disdainful dragon. Sylvia sat silent, hands folded in her lap, but twice Poirot caught her staring at the door, as though expecting someone who would never come. And Damien watched everyone, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the smile of a man who keeps a loaded revolver in his pocket and enjoys the knowledge. The great clock in the long gallery struck 9 with a single mournful chime that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Everyone flinched except Poirot and Damien. Lady Evelyn set down her glass with a click. "Monsieur Poirot, perhaps after dinner you would care to take a little tour of the house? There are certain matters I wish to discuss privately." "Of course, madame." Coffee was served in the drawing-room, a cavernous apartment with frayed brocade and a pianoforte no one had opened in years. As the party broke into uneasy knots, Poirot found himself momentarily alone with Sylvia Blackwood beside the fire. "You are not happy here, mademoiselle," he said softly. She started. "Is it so obvious? To Hercule Poirot, yes. This house, it oppresses you." "It oppresses everyone," she whispered, "ever since Uncle Reginald died. Aunt Evelyn tries, but—" She glanced toward Lady Evelyn, who was speaking urgently to Dr. Leland in a corner. "There are secrets here, monsieur, terrible ones, and that clock—" She broke off as Damien sauntered over. "Run along, little cousin," he said mockingly. "The great detective and I must have a manly chat." Sylvia flushed and slipped away. Damien offered Poirot a cigarette from a silver case. Poirot declined with a polite gesture. "Tell me, Monsieur Poirot," Damien said, lighting his own, "do you believe in ghosts?" "I believe in many things, monsieur. Ghosts, no. Guilty consciences that masquerade as ghosts. Those I encounter frequently." Damien's smile thinned. "Touché. Though in this house the two may amount to the same thing." At 10 o'clock Lady Evelyn reappeared at Poirot's elbow. "If you are ready." She led him back through the hall and along a passage that grew colder with every step. At the far end stood double doors of blackened oak. She opened them and ushered him inside. The long gallery stretched perhaps 80 feet. lit only by a single lamp at the near end and the dying glow of a fire. Suits of armour lined the walls like a silent army. Between two tall windows stood the grandfather clock. It was magnificent, taller than a man, the case of ebony inlaid with mother-of-pearl, the face painted with moons and stars and strange astrological symbols. The pendulum, a great brass disc, swung with ponderous majesty. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound filled the gallery like a heartbeat. Lady Evelyn closed the doors behind them. For a moment she seemed unable to speak. Then the words came in a rush. "Monsieur Poirot, 3 nights ago I received an anonymous letter. It said that unless I paid £50,000, an impossible sum, someone in this house would die before the new moon. And the letter was pushed under the door of that clock." She pointed with a trembling finger. "I thought at first it was a cruel joke. Damien is wild, Clarissa resentful, the Lelands always need money. But last night—" She pressed a hand to her mouth. "Last night the clock struck 13 at midnight. 13, Monsieur Poirot. I heard it myself, though the mechanism has been broken these 20 years, and this morning I found this." From her pocket she drew a single playing card, the Queen of Spades, its face slashed violently with a knife. Poirot turned the card over in his neat fingers. On the back, in the same hurried aristocratic hand that had written his invitation, were the words, "The first stroke has fallen. The next will be fatal." He looked up slowly. In the flickering lamplight, Lady Evelyn's face was a mask of terror. "Someone in this house intends murder," she whispered, "and I believe the clock itself is part of it." Far above them, in the rafters of the old house, something shifted and creaked as though the building listened. Poirot tucked the card carefully into his waistcoat pocket. "Alors," he said quietly, "we begin." Behind them, the great pendulum continued its relentless arc. Tick-tock, tick-tock, counting down. Chapter 3. Whispers of the grandfather clock. Poirot did not sleep well. The guest bed was excellent. The fire had been banked high, and the hot water bottle placed by a thoughtful maid was perfection itself. Yet twice in the night he woke with the absolute conviction that someone was standing at the foot of his bed breathing. Both times the room was empty. Only the echo of the great clock in the long gallery reached him, distant, patient, inexorable. At 7 o'clock he rose, performed his exercises, anointed the moustaches with a new pomade à la bergamote, and descended in search of coffee. Hawkins intercepted him in the hall with a silver tray. "Her ladyship's compliments, sir. She begs you will take breakfast in the morning room and join her in the long gallery at 9:30. She has asked that no one else disturb you until then." Poirot's eyebrows rose a fraction. "She is wise, your mistress. Already she understands that Hercule Poirot requires solitude in which to arrange the little grey cells." He drank 2 cups of excellent coffee, ate 1 perfectly poached egg, and at 28 minutes past 9 presented himself at the double doors of the long gallery. Lady Evelyn was waiting, wrapped in a sable coat despite the fire that now blazed at the far end. She looked as though she had not slept at all. "You wish me to examine the clock?" Poirot said. It was not a question. "Yes, but first—" She hesitated, then drew a small key from her pocket. "There is something inside the house that should have been destroyed years ago. I want you to see it before the others are about." She led him not to the clock, but to a small door concealed behind a tapestry of Diana hunting. A narrow staircase spiraled downward into chill darkness. At the bottom, another door, this one iron-bound. Lady Evelyn's hand shook as she turned the key. They stepped into a stone chamber no larger than a monk's cell. A single bulb glared from the ceiling. Against the far wall stood an iron safe of Victorian design. Lady Evelyn spun the combination with practised speed and pulled the heavy door open. Inside lay a single object. A leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and dark with age. "My husband's private diary," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "He made me swear never to read it. After his death, I broke that promise." There is a passage dated December 1905, the night his elder brother Charles disappeared. Read it, Monsieur Poirot. Then you will understand why that clock has never struck the hour since. Poirot took the journal with reverence. The page fell open, as though it had been read 1,000 times. 34 December, 1905. The deed is done. Giles quarrelled with father one time too many over the estate, over money, over Sylvia. Poor child, she will never know her true father. I struck him in anger with the poker. He fell against the clock case. The door swung open. In panic, I pushed him inside. The pendulum caught his coat. One dreadful blow, and it was finished. The mechanism jammed with the écart. Wait. We walled the lower panel that same night and swore the clock had simply failed. No one has opened the case since. God forgive me, Evelyn must never know. The clock keeps its secret, and I keep mine. R.B. Poirot closed the book slowly. The chill in the chamber was no longer only from the stone. "So," he said at last, "your husband murdered his brother and concealed the body inside the clock itself. 20 years ago, the clock ceased to chime because it carried a corpse, and now someone in this house has discovered the truth." Lady Evelyn's face was ash-grey. "I think so. 3 months ago the lower panel was prized open, just enough to see inside. I found scratches, fresh ones. Someone knows. And the anonymous letters began shortly after." "Yes." Poirot tapped the journal against his palm. "This knowledge, madame, is a loaded revolver in the wrong hands. £50,000 is a modest price for silence, when the alternative is the gallows. But blackmailers are rarely content with one payment. Tell me, who besides yourself has access to this cellar?" "Only Hawkins and Mrs. Dane, the housekeeper. And Damien, of course. He has keys to everything." They returned upstairs in silence. In the long gallery, the morning light filtered weakly through mullioned windows, turning the dust motes into slow golden snow. The clock towered over them, ebony and enigmatic. Poirot approached it as one approaches a sleeping tiger. He studied the face first. Roman numerals, twin moon dials, a ship that rocked eternally on painted waves. Then the case, exquisite marquetry of Venus and Mars entwined. At shoulder height, a small keyhole for winding. Lower down, the door that concealed weights and pendulum. He knelt, heedless of his immaculate trousers, and examined the lower panel Lady Evelyn had mentioned. Fresh scratches were indeed visible around the lock, and a thin line of sawdust still clung to the carving. "Someone has been busy," he murmured. He took from his pocket a small electric torch and a magnifying lens. "May I?" Lady Evelyn nodded mutely. The lock was old, but not complicated. Within seconds, Poirot had it open. The door swung outward on silent hinges. A wave of cold air rolled out, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable odour of death, not fresh, but old, dry papery. Poirot directed the beam inside. The pendulum hung motionless, its brass disc tarnished almost black. Behind it, the weights were suspended on frayed cords thick with cobwebs. And wedged into the narrow space between backboard and pendulum, exactly where a falling body might lodge, was something that had once been a man. Little remained but bones, tatters of evening dress, and a skull whose lower jaw had been shattered by the descending weight. One skeletal hand still clutched a scrap of crimson silk, a woman's scarf perhaps. Lady Evelyn made a small choked sound and turned away. Poirot continued his examination with clinical calm. The skeleton's coat pocket had been torn open recently. A few shreds of paper still fluttered like moths. He reached in carefully and extracted them. 3 fragments only, but enough. Cannot marry, scandal, child, ruin the family. Do your duty, or the handwriting was the same as the anonymous letters. Poirot straightened and closed the clock door with gentle finality. Your husband's victim has been discovered, madame, and the discoverer is among your guests. At that moment, the long gallery doors opened, and Damien sauntered in, hands in pockets, a cigarette dangling from his lips. Good morning, Aunt. I see you've introduced our celebrity to the family skeleton. Literally, it seems. Lady Evelyn gasped. Damien, how long have you known? Oh, months, darling Aunt. One gets frightfully bored in the country. Poking about in cellars passes the time. His smile was wolfish. Poor Uncle Giles, such an inconvenient corpse. Poirot regarded him steadily. You are very cool, monsieur, for a man who has been sending blackmail letters. Damien's eyes narrowed, but the smile remained. Have I? How clever of you to deduce it so quickly. Though I must say 50,000 is rather steep these days. Inflation, you know. You will return the photographs you took of the diary, if you please, Poirot said quietly. Damien laughed outright. Photographs? My dear Monsieur Poirot, I'm not nearly so crude. I have the original negatives safely deposited with my solicitor. They will be published in the event of my untimely death or arrest. Insurance, you understand? He flicked ash onto the priceless parquet. But don't look so grim. I'm not the villain of the piece, not yet. Someone else entirely plans to use dear Uncle Giles for their own ends. And tonight, unless I'm very much mistaken, they intend to add a fresh body to the clock's collection. He glanced at the ornate face above them. Listen. From somewhere deep inside, the mechanism came a faint, metallic click, as though a hidden spring had been released. Damien's voice dropped to a theatrical whisper. The clock is being rewound, Monsieur Poirot, for the first time in 20 years, and when it strikes again, someone will die. He turned on his heel and strolled out, leaving a trail of cigarette smoke and dread behind him. Lady Evelyn clutched Poirot's arm. What did he mean? Who is rewinding it? Poirot looked up at the great silent disk, at the skeletal passenger hidden behind it, and felt the little grey cells blaze into furious life. Someone, madame, who believes that history repeats itself, and tonight is the anniversary of the original crime. New Year's Eve approaches. The stage is set for an encore. Far above them, invisible in the dusty heights of the case, something shifted with a soft, deliberate scrape. The clock was listening again. Chapter 4. The Fatal Evening Gathering. The day crawled, forward, under a sky the colour of wet iron. Rain lashed the windows of Blackwood Manor in sheets, drumming on the leads like impatient fingers. Inside, the house seemed to contract, corridors growing narrower, ceilings lower, every shadow thicker than the night before. Poirot spent the morning in the library, ostensibly reading a first edition of Don, actually watching the household through the half-open door. They moved like actors who had forgotten their lines yet dared not leave the stage. Clarissa Vale flitted past twice, clutching a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, her face blotched with recent weeping. Colonel Bannister marched up and down the hall humming Tipperary under his breath, a sure sign of agitation in an old soldier. Dr. Leland disappeared into the old still-room with a black leather case, and emerged an hour later smelling strongly of carbolic. Beatrice Leland sat in the window seat of the morning room, filing her nails to dagger points, occasionally glancing at the drive as though expecting a lover who would never arrive. Sylvia Blackwood remained invisible until luncheon, when she appeared white-faced and silent, picking at her food like a bird. Only Damien seemed at ease, lounging in the billiard-room, potting balls with lazy precision and whistling Mad About the Boy off-key. Poirot noted everything, said almost nothing, and waited. At 6 o'clock the storm reached its climax. Thunder rolled over the downs like artillery. The lights flickered, steadied, then died entirely, plunging the house into darkness broken only by lightning that bleached every face, corpse-pale for an instant. When the candles were brought, Lady Evelyn's hand shook so violently that wax spattered her cuff. "Dinner will be served at 8 as usual," she announced, but her voice cracked on the last word. Poirot touched her sleeve. "Madame, if I may suggest, perhaps a slight change of plan. Let us all gather in the long gallery at 7:30. I have something to say that concerns every person in this house." A ripple of alarm passed around the table. Damien raised an eyebrow. "A command performance? How deliciously theatrical!" Lady Evelyn looked at Poirot for a long moment, then inclined her head. "Very well. 7:30 in the long gallery." The intervening hour was unbearable. Poirot retired to his room, locked the door, and laid upon the bed every scrap of evidence he possessed. The slashed Queen of Spades, the diary fragments, the torn blackmail photograph he had quietly removed from Damien's dressing table, while the young man was at billiards. A blurred image of the skeleton, time-stamped 3 months earlier. He arranged them like pieces on a chessboard, and stared until the pattern became clear. At 7:25, he descended. The long gallery had been transformed. Extra candelabra blazed along its length, throwing pools of gold on armour and tapestry. The great clock loomed at the far end, its ebony case drinking the light. Someone, Hawkins presumably, had polished the mother-of-pearl inlays until they gleamed like cruel eyes. The household assembled in uneasy knots. Lady Evelyn stood near the fireplace, gripping a small velvet bag as though it contained her heart. Damien leaned against a suit of armour, a glass of whisky in one hand, mockery in his eyes. Sylvia hovered close to her aunt, clutching a rosary, though the Blackwoods had been Protestant for 4 centuries. Clarissa Vale sat rigid on a tapestry-covered settle, lips moving soundlessly. Colonel Bannister had stationed himself by the windows, staring out at the storm as if it were an advancing enemy. The Lelands stood slightly apart. Maurice twisting his signet ring, Beatrice smoking with quick, angry puffs. At exactly 7:30, Poirot entered and closed the doors behind him with a soft but definite click. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began pleasantly, "I have asked you here tonight because a murder was committed in this house 20 years ago, and another is planned for this very evening. Before the night is out, one person among us will attempt to add a fresh corpse to the one already concealed within that clock." He gestured toward the ebony monster. A collective gasp rose. Sylvia crossed herself. Dr. Leland went the colour of tallow. Damien laughed softly. "Really, Poirot, you do know how to clear a room of small talk." Poirot ignored him. "Let us be clear. Mr. Giles Blackwood was murdered by his brother Reginald on New Year's Eve 1905 and hidden inside the clock. The mechanism jammed, the clock ceased to strike, and the secret slept for 20 years. 3 months ago, the secret was rediscovered. Since then, blackmail, terror, and now murder have stalked these corridors. He walked slowly down the gallery, candlelight flashing on his spectacles. Someone in this room knows exactly where the body lies. Someone has been demanding £50,000 to keep silent. And tonight, unless Hercule Poirot prevents it, that someone intends to silence forever the one person who can expose them. He paused before the clock. The pendulum, which had hung motionless for 2 decades, now swung with slow majesty. Someone had indeed rewound it. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound filled the gallery like a funeral drum. Colonel Bannister found his voice first. "Damned if I'll stay here to be accused by a foreign policeman. Come, Evelyn!" He took 1 step toward the door. At that instant, every candle in the room guttered, as though a wind had passed through sealed windows. Thunder crashed directly overhead, and from the clock came a new sound, a faint metallic grinding, as though ancient gears long seized were being forced into motion. Sylvia screamed. The clock began to strike. 1, 2, 3, each chime deeper, more resonant than the last, as though the house itself tolled the bell. 4, 5, 6, people shrank back, instinctively. 7, 8, 9. Beatrice Leland dropped her cigarette and ground it beneath her heel with frantic twists. 10, 11, 12. Silence should have fallen. Instead, the mechanism gave a dreadful groaning shudder and delivered a 13th stroke, lower, slower, vibrating in the bones. In the frozen instant that followed, the lights, which had been restored an hour earlier, flared blindingly bright, then exploded in a shower of sparks. Darkness swallowed the gallery. There was a confusion of movement, a woman's high, tearing scream, the crash of a falling body, and then, cutting through everything, a single appalling thud from inside the clock, exactly as though something heavy had been struck by the descending pendulum. When Hawkins and the footman burst in with fresh candles 30 seconds later, the scene was nightmare. Lady Evelyn lay in a crumpled heap, unconscious. Sylvia was on her knees, sobbing. Dr. Leland knelt beside a figure, sprawled face down before the clock. Colonel Bannister's military voice barked, "Stand back! Give the man air!" Poirot was already there, turning the body over with gentle strength. Clarissa Vale stared up at them with eyes already glazing. A thin line of blood trickled from her left temple. In her right hand, she still clutched the torn fragments of old love letters, the ones Poirot had seen her carrying that morning. But it was the clock that held every gaze. Its lower door hung open. Fresh blood streaked the pendulum, which now hung motionless again, dripping slowly onto the parquet. And wedged half inside the case, exactly where Giles Blackwood's skeleton had lodged 20 years earlier, lay Clarissa Vale's body, one arm twisted grotesquely by the fatal blow. Poirot straightened, his face graver than anyone had yet seen it. "Mon Dieu!" he said very softly. "The past has repeated itself with horrible precision. The clock has claimed its second victim." Above them, the ebony face with its painted moons seemed almost to smile. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the candlelight, the murderer stood unseen, watching the little grey cells begin their hunt. Chapter 4. The Fatal Evening Gathering. The day crawled forward under a sky the colour of wet iron. Rain lashed the windows of Blackwood Manor in sheets, drumming on the leads like impatient fingers. Inside, the house seemed to contract, corridors growing narrower, ceilings lower, every shadow thicker than the night before. Poirot spent the morning in the library, ostensibly reading a first edition of Donne, actually watching the household through the half-open door. They moved like actors who had forgotten their lines yet dared not leave the stage. Clarissa Vale flitted past twice, clutching a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, her face blotched with recent weeping. Colonel Bannister marched up and down the hall humming Tipperary under his breath, a sure sign of agitation in an old soldier. Dr. Leland disappeared into the old still room with a black leather case, and emerged an hour later smelling strongly of carbolic. Beatrice Leland sat in the window seat of the morning room, filing her nails to dagger points, occasionally glancing at the drive, as though expecting a lover who would never arrive. Sylvia Blackwood remained invisible until luncheon, when she appeared white-faced and silent, picking at her food like a bird. Only Damien seemed at ease, lounging in the billiard-room, potting balls with lazy precision and whistling Mad About the Boy off-key. Poirot noted everything, said almost nothing, and waited. At 6 o'clock the storm reached its climax. Thunder rolled over the downs like artillery. The lights flickered, steadied, then died entirely, plunging the house into darkness broken only by lightning that bleached every face corpse-pale for an instant. When the candles were brought, Lady Evelyn's hand shook so violently that wax spattered her cuff. "Dinner will be served at 8 as usual," she announced. But her voice cracked on the last word. Poirot touched her sleeve. "Madame, if I may suggest, perhaps a slight change of plan. Let us all gather in the long gallery at 7:30. I have something to say that concerns every person in this house." A ripple of alarm passed around the table. Damien raised an eyebrow. "A command performance? How deliciously theatrical!" Lady Evelyn looked at Poirot for a long moment, then inclined her head. "Very well. 7:30 in the long gallery." The intervening hour was unbearable. Poirot retired to his room, locked the door, and laid upon the bed every scrap of evidence he possessed. The slashed Queen of Spades, the diary fragments, the torn blackmail photograph he had quietly removed from Damien's dressing table while the young man was at billiards. A blurred image of the skeleton time-stamped 3 months earlier. He arranged them like pieces on a chessboard and stared until the pattern became clear. At 7:25 he descended. The long gallery had been transformed. Extra candelabra blazed along its length, throwing pools of gold on armour and tapestry. The great clock loomed at the far end, its ebony case drinking the light. Someone, Hawkins presumably, had polished the mother-of-pearl inlays until they gleamed like cruel eyes. The household assembled in uneasy knots. Lady Evelyn stood near the fireplace, gripping a small velvet bag as though it contained her heart. Damien leaned against a suit of armour, a glass of whisky in one hand, mockery in his eyes. Sylvia hovered close to her aunt, clutching a rosary, though the Blackwoods had been Protestant for 4 centuries. Clarissa Vale sat rigid on a tapestry-covered settle, lips moving soundlessly. Colonel Bannister had stationed himself by the windows, staring out at the storm as if it were an advancing enemy. The Lelands stood slightly apart. Maurice twisting his signet ring, Beatrice smoking, with quick, angry puffs. At exactly 7:30 Poirot entered and closed the doors behind him with a soft but definite click. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began pleasantly, "I have asked you here tonight because a murder was committed in this house 20 years ago, and another is planned for this very evening. Before the night is out, one person among us will attempt to add a fresh corpse to the one already concealed within that clock." He gestured toward the ebony monster. A collective gasp rose. Sylvia crossed herself. Dr. Leland went the colour of tallow. Damien laughed softly. "Really, Poirot, you do know how to clear a room of small talk." Poirot ignored him. "Let us be clear. Mr. Giles Blackwood was murdered by his brother Reginald on New Year's Eve 1905 and hidden inside the clock. The mechanism jammed, the clock ceased to strike, and the secret slept for 20 years. 3 months ago, the secret was rediscovered. Since then, blackmail, terror, and now murder have stalked these corridors." He walked slowly down the gallery, candlelight flashing on his spectacles. "Someone in this room knows exactly where the body lies. Someone has been demanding £50,000 to keep silent. And tonight, unless Hercule Poirot prevents it, that someone intends to silence forever the one person who can expose them." He paused before the clock. The pendulum, which had hung motionless for 2 decades, now swung with slow majesty. Someone had indeed rewound it. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound filled the gallery like a funeral drum. Colonel Bannister found his voice first. "Damned if I'll stay here to be accused by a foreign policeman. Come, Evelyn." He took 1 step toward the door. At that instant, every candle in the room guttered as though a wind had passed through sealed windows. Thunder crashed directly overhead, and from the clock came a new sound, a faint metallic grinding, as though ancient gears long seized were being forced into motion. Sylvia screamed. The clock began to strike. 1, 2, 3, each chime deeper, more resonant than the last, as though the house itself tolled the bell. 4, 5, 6, people shrank back instinctively. 7, 8, 9. Beatrice Leland dropped her cigarette and ground it beneath her heel with frantic twists. 10, 11, 12. Silence should have fallen. Instead, the mechanism gave a dreadful groaning shudder and delivered a 13th stroke, lower, slower, vibrating in the bones. In the frozen instant that followed, the lights, which had been restored an hour earlier, flared blindingly bright, then exploded in a shower of sparks. Darkness swallowed the gallery. There was a confusion of movement, a woman's high, tearing scream, the crash of a falling body, and then, cutting through everything, a single appalling thud from inside the clock, exactly as though something heavy had been struck by the descending pendulum, when Hawkins and the footman burst in with fresh candles. 30 seconds later, the scene was nightmare. Lady Evelyn lay in a crumpled heap, unconscious. Sylvia was on her knees, sobbing. Dr. Leland knelt beside a figure sprawled face down before the clock. Colonel Bannister's military voice barked, "Stand back! Give the man air!" Poirot was already there, turning the body over with gentle strength. Clarissa Vale stared up at them with eyes already glazing. A thin line of blood trickled from her left temple. In her right hand, she still clutched the torn fragments of old love letters, the ones Poirot had seen her carrying that morning. But it was the clock that held every gaze. Its lower door hung open. Fresh blood streaked the pendulum, which now hung motionless again, dripping slowly onto the parquet. And wedged half inside the case, exactly where Giles Blackwood's skeleton had lodged 20 years earlier, lay Clarissa Vale's body, one arm twisted grotesquely by the fatal blow. Poirot straightened, his face graver than anyone had yet seen it. "Mon Dieu," he said very softly, "the past has repeated itself with horrible precision. The clock has claimed its second victim." Above them, the ebony face with its painted moons seemed almost to smile. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the candlelight, the murderer stood unseen, watching the little grey cells begin their hunt. Chapter 5. Body Behind the Pendulum. The candles burned straight and steady now, as though the house itself had drawn a breath and was holding it. Clarissa Vale lay on her back before the open clock, one shoe fallen away, stockinged foot pathetically small. The wound at her temple was neat, a single crushing blow. The brass pendulum, still wet with her blood, hung motionless behind her shoulders like a guillotine that had done its work. Poirot knelt, gloved fingers moving with the delicacy of a watchmaker. He touched nothing, yet saw everything. Death was instantaneous, he announced without looking up. The skull is fractured. The weapon, the pendulum itself, descending with the full weight of the clock behind it. Observe, the arc is exactly right. She was struck as she bent forward, perhaps to place or retrieve something from the lower compartment. Dr. Leland, pale but professional, confirmed with a nod. Yes, massive depressed fracture. She would have known nothing. Lady Evelyn, revived with brandy and smelling salts, stood supported by Sylvia. Her eyes were fixed on the corpse with a horror too deep for tears. Clarissa! Poor Clarissa! She never harmed anyone. Damien, for once stripped of mockery, stared as though someone had punched him in the soul. My God, he whispered, it actually happened, just like Uncle Giles. Colonel Bannister cleared his throat repeatedly, the sound of a man trying not to be sick. Beatrice Leland lit another cigarette with shaking fingers. Someone pushed her, she said flatly, or pulled her. The lights went out. Anyone could have— No, madam, Poirot interrupted gently. No one pushed or pulled. Observe the position of the body. Mademoiselle Vale was alone directly in front of the clock when the lights failed. The rest of you were clustered nearer the fireplace, 10-12 feet away. In 30 seconds of complete darkness, it is not possible to cross that distance, strike with such precision, and return without collision or outcry. No, the clock itself killed her. He rose and faced them. What we have witnessed is murder by mechanism. The oldest trick in the book, yet executed with diabolical cunning. Someone prepared this death hours, perhaps days ago. He turned to the clock. The lower door still hung open. Inside, Giles Blackwood's skeleton had been shoved rudely aside to make room for the new tenant. The brass weight that drove the striking train now rested inches from Clarissa's broken head. Poirot's torch beam played over the interior. Regardez, the striking mechanism has been expertly repaired. New wire on the pulleys, fresh oil on the pivots. Someone is a competent horologist. And here— He indicated a thin tripwire, almost invisible, stretched across the lower opening at ankle height. When Mademoiselle Vale stepped across this wire, perhaps to place those letters she carried, she released the detente. The weight fell. The pendulum, already at the top of its arc, descended with irresistible force. C'est ça! Sylvia gave a low, moaning cry. But why? Clarissa had no money. Who would want her dead? Poirot's gaze swept the room and settled on Lady Evelyn. Madame, you told me the anonymous letters demanded £50,000 to keep the secret of Giles Blackwood's murder. Yet tonight, the victim is not you, the one person who could pay, but your companion, who could pay nothing. That is instructive. He moved to Clarissa's body and gently opened the clenched fingers of her left hand. From them he drew a single sheet of heavy cream notepaper, Blackwood Manor letterhead, folded small. Poirot unfolded it with care. The ink was still faintly damp. To whom it may concern, I know who murdered Giles Blackwood in 1905 and who has been blackmailing Lady Evelyn these 3 months past. I have proof that will send the killer to the gallows. Meet me in the Long Gallery at 7:30 tonight, or the truth goes to the police at dawn. Clarissa Vale. Silence fell, thick as velvet. Poirot looked up slowly. Mademoiselle Vale believed she was summoning the blackmailer to confront him. Instead, she walked into the trap prepared for another. She was not the intended victim, she was the substitute. Lady Evelyn swayed. "You mean the trap was set for me?" "Précisément, madame. Someone wished you dead in exactly the same manner as Giles Blackwood, struck down by the clock on the anniversary of the original crime. Poetic, n'est-ce pas? But Mademoiselle Vale, carrying this note, arrived first. She bent to leave it inside the clock. Where better to hide a message in a room full of hiding places? She triggered the mechanism. The clock claimed the wrong life." He turned to Damien. "Monsieur, you told me this morning that the clock was being rewound for the first time in 20 years. You spoke almost with admiration. Yet now we discover the work was far advanced. When exactly did you notice this?" Damien's face was chalk white. I don't remember. Yesterday, perhaps. Or perhaps you did the work yourself." "Steady on," Colonel Bannister barked. "Young Blackwood may be a wastrel, but he's no murderer." Poirot raised a placatory hand. "I accuse no one, yet. But consider. The murderer needed 3 things. First, knowledge of the skeleton and the diary. Second, skill with clock mechanisms. Third, opportunity to prepare the trap unseen. Who possesses all 3? He began to pace, small, neat steps between the pools of candlelight. Lady Evelyn herself, she knew everything but would hardly arrange her own death. Damien, he admits discovering the body months ago and has prowled the house at will. Dr. Leland, a scientist, handy with delicate instruments. The Colonel, an engineer in the war, familiar with timing devices. Even Mrs. Leland, who studied mathematics at Girton and might enjoy the elegance of such a mechanism. Beatrice gave a short, scornful laugh. "Don't forget poor Clarissa. She was clever too. Perhaps she arranged her own death for the insurance." "Impossible," Dr. Leland snapped. "The tripwire was tied from inside. She could not have fastened it after entering." Poirot nodded approval. "Exactement, docteur. You have the mechanical mind." He stopped before the clock and addressed it almost conversationally. "Someone in this room spent hours inside this case, oiling, adjusting, tying that fatal wire. Someone knew Clarissa would come early, because they arranged it. Someone watched from the shadows as the lights went out, knowing the trap was sprung. He reached into the clock and, with infinite care, detached the tripwire. It was ordinary picture cord, but knotted in an unusual way, a double carrick bend, the sort of knot beloved by sailors. Poirot held it up. "Colonel Bannister, you were in the Royal Navy before the trenches, I believe." The old soldier flushed crimson. "What if I was? Thousands of men can tie a carrick bend." "True, but how many also possess a motive?" He moved to Clarissa's side again, and from her pocket drew the bundle of faded letters he had seen her carrying all day. The ribbon had been retied hastily. One letter had slipped half out. Poirot extracted it. The handwriting was young, passionate, desperate. "My darling Clarissa, if my brother discovers us, he will kill me, and you. Meet me tonight in the long gallery after the house sleeps. The clock will hide us both." Forever Giles Lady Evelyn made a small animal sound of pain. "So Giles and Clarissa were lovers," Poirot said softly. 20 years ago, she was a young housemaid in this very house. Giles promised to run away with her, and the child she perhaps carried. Instead, he quarrelled with Reginald and died the same night. Clarissa stayed on, faithful to a ghost, watching the family that destroyed her happiness. He looked at Lady Evelyn. "You kept her out of guilt, did you not?" Lady Evelyn could only nod. Clarissa's death suddenly became infinitely more terrible, not just a mistake, but the final act in a tragedy begun 2 decades earlier. Poirot turned to the silent group. The past is not dead here. It has simply been waiting behind the pendulum. He closed the clock door with a soft click of the latch. Tomorrow, he said, when daylight comes, we will dismantle this machine of murder piece by piece, and we will discover whose hands are stained with oil as well as blood. Far above them, in the dusty heights of the case, something small and metallic shifted with a faint, betraying clink. Poirot's head snapped up. For the first time that night, the little Belgian smiled. A small, cold smile that held no mirth at all. "Patience, mon ami," he murmured to the darkness. "Hercule Poirot is closer than you think." Outside, the storm began to move on, leaving only the slow drip of water from the eaves and the steady, patient ticking of a clock that had tasted blood twice in 20 years. Chapter 6. Interrogations in the drawing room. The house did not sleep. It lay rigid, listening to itself creak and sigh like an old man turning on a bed of nails. At 10:30, Poirot had the footman carry Clarissa Vale's body to the ice house behind the stables. The local police would not arrive before noon. The roads were flooded, the telephone wires down, and Poirot had no intention of letting evidence cool along with the corpse. He locked the ice house door himself and pocketed the key. Then he ordered coffee, strong, black and copious, and had the great drawing-room prepared. Fires lit at both ends, all lamps blazing, every curtain drawn against the dripping night. One by one, like penitents summoned to judgment, they filed in and took the seats he indicated. Poirot stood with his back to the mantel, there, small, compact, immaculate. The green waistcoat gleamed, the moustaches were magnificent. Only his eyes, cold, bright, relentless, betrayed the hunter. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "a woman is dead. The method was ingenious, the motive ancient, the execution almost perfect, almost. Hercule Poirot is here, and perfection is reserved for him alone. We will now establish, with clarity and comfort, exactly where each of you was when the lights failed and the clock struck its 13th chime." He placed a silver cigarette box on the table, unopened, and beside it the little coil of picture cord with its double carrick bend. "Colonel Bannister, we begin with Hugh." The old soldier sat very straight, as though on parade. I was by the window, looking out at the storm. When the lights went, I took one step toward Lady Evelyn, heard the scream, the thud, and that was that. Yet you are an engineer, no? You understand fuses, timing devices? I've wired a bridge to blow, sir, but I've never murdered a woman with a grandfather clock. Poirot inclined his head. "Noted." He turned to Dr. Maurice Leland. "Monsieur le Docteur, you are closest to the door. You have delicate hands, the hands of a man who repairs watches, perhaps." Leland flushed. "I wear gloves in the laboratory. My hobby is microscopes, not clocks." "And yet you spent 2 hours this afternoon in the old still-room, which contains, among other things, a lathe and fine tools." Leland opened his mouth, closed it again. Poirot moved on. "Madame Leland." Beatrice met his gaze coolly. "I was beside my husband. I dropped my cigarette, remember? You can still smell the burn on my glove." She held up the kid glove. A tiny scorched circle was visible. Indeed, a small, perfect alibi. One wonders if it was prepared in advance. Beatrice's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Sylvia Blackwood sat shrinking into her chair, rosary beads clicking between white fingers. "Mademoiselle Sylvia, you screamed first. Why?" I felt something brush past me in the dark, like a hand, cold. Yet no one admits to moving, curious." Damien sprawled at the end of the sofa, pale but composed. "And you, Monsieur le Cynique?" Damien gave his lazy smile. "I was exactly where I am now, 10 feet from the clock, drinking whiskey, wondering why my aunt keeps such poisonous company." Poirot's gaze lingered on him longest. "Last, Lady Evelyn." She had been brought a chair near the fire. Both hands clutched the velvet bag as if it were a lifebelt. "I stood by the mantel," she said faintly. "I never moved until the lights returned, and I saw poor Clarissa." Poirot nodded slowly. "Excellent. All alibis are satisfactory. All are worthless. Because the perfect murder does not require the murderer to be beside the victim at the moment of death. It only requires him or her to be beside the clock some hours earlier." He took from his pocket a small tin of grey powder and a soft brush. "Fingerprints, mes amis. The lower panel of the clock has been wiped clean, very clean, except for one place, the inside of the door, where the tripwire was fastened. There we find prints, one set only, and they are fresh." He let the silence stretch until it hummed. "Colonel Bannister, your prints are on file at the War Office. Dr. Leland, you were fingerprinted when you took out your license to prescribe morphine. Madame Leland, the French police obliged you during that little misunderstanding in Biarritz in 1928. Damien, Scotland Yard has yours from the affair of the forged Stubbs painting. Even dear, departed Clarissa left prints on the letters she carried." He brushed the powder gently across a glass negative he had produced from his waistcoat. "And here are the prints from the clock. Observe." He held the negative to the lamplight. The whorls were clear, unmistakable. A single gasp escaped the room. The prints did not match any person present. Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "Impossible, you think? Not at all. The prints belong to someone who should have been here tonight, but was not. Someone whose hands oiled the gears and tied the fatal knot." He turned the negative so all could see the name written beneath in his neat continental hand. "Giles Blackwood, taken from the diary cover, 1905. For a moment no one breathed. Then Damien began to laugh, low, incredulous, almost admiring. "You're saying a corpse repaired the clock that killed him 20 years ago? Bravo, Poirot! That's a new one even for you. Not the corpse," Poirot corrected gently. "The living man who shares Giles Blackwood's fingerprints. Because identical fingerprints occur only in one instance. Identical twins." He let the word fall like a stone into still water. Reginald Blackwood murdered his brother Giles and walled him in the clock. But Giles, it seems, had a twin, a secret twin, raised separately, perhaps sent abroad, perhaps institutionalized, someone the family believed dead or vanished, someone who has now returned to avenge his brother and to claim what he believes is his birthright. Lady Evelyn rose slowly, the colour of ash. "No," she whispered, "it cannot be." Poirot's eyes were compassionate but merciless. "Madame, you married Reginald in 1906, 1 year after the disappearance. You told me yourself you never met Giles. Is it not possible that the man you married was not Reginald at all, but the surviving twin who took his brother's place, murdered the real heir, and lived the life that should have been Giles's?" The velvet bag slipped from her fingers and fell open. Inside lay a miniature portrait on ivory. A young man in evening dress, dark, handsome, arrogant. The face was Damien Blackwood's, 25 years younger. Damien stopped laughing. Poirot walked to him and placed the miniature in his unresisting hand. "Behold your true father, monsieur. Giles Blackwood lives in you. And tonight, whether you knew it or not, his ghost used your hands to repair the clock that killed him, and to kill again." Damien stared at the portrait as though it burned. Outside the storm had passed. A pale moon rode over the flooded fields, silvering the great clock in the gallery where 2 bodies now lay. One 20 years dead, one only hours. Somewhere in the house a door closed very softly. Poirot looked toward the sound. "The play is not finished," he murmured. "The final act remains." Chapter 7. Hidden Passages and Forgotten Letters. The drawing-room fire had sunk to a sullen, red glow. The clocks of Blackwood Manor, every one of them wrong by a few minutes, struck 3 in a ragged, discordant chorus. No one had gone to bed. No one could. Poirot stood alone in the long gallery, a single electric torch in his hand. The great clock had been sealed again. The local constable, soaked and surly, had arrived at midnight and been posted outside the door, with strict orders to let no one enter. Poirot, however, had kept a second key. He opened the lower panel once more and played the beams slowly across the interior. Giles Blackwood's skeleton had been removed to the ice-house beside Clarissa Vale, but the brass pendulum still bore its dark stain. Poirot was not looking at the pendulum. He was looking for what had changed since last he stood here. A thin scrape of fresh wood caught the light. A narrow panel at the very back of the case had been slid aside, revealing a black rectangle no wider than a man's shoulders. A secret passage. "Bien sûr," he murmured. "The house is riddled with priests' holes and smugglers' tunnels. Why should the clock itself not be a door?" He stepped inside. The space was coffin-narrow, smelling of ancient cedar and something sharper, gun oil, perhaps. A spiral of iron rungs, newly greased, led upward into darkness. Poirot climbed with the agility of a much younger man, his torch clenched between his teeth. 20 feet up, he emerged into a tiny chamber hidden behind the clock's upper case. Moonlight filtered through a slit no wider than an arrow loop. On the floor lay the tools of the murderer's trade: a small oil can, a set of watchmaker's files, a ball of picture cord, and most damning of all, a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. Poirot knelt and untied the ribbon with reverent care. The topmost letter was addressed in a woman's hand, faded but unmistakable. "My beloved Giles, if you will not leave with me and the child tonight, then I swear I shall tell Reginald everything. Meet me at the clock when the house sleeps. Come, or lose me forever. Clarissa, 30 Wartons. December 1905. Below it in a different ink, a man's hurried scrawl. I cannot. Reginald has discovered us. He is beside himself. Forgive me. G. And beneath that, a third hand, masculine, impatient, almost identical to the second. He knows too much. Tonight ends it." Our Poirot's breath came very softly. 2 brothers, 1 woman, 1 child, and 20 years later the child had returned. He slipped the letters into his pocket and continued upward. The iron rungs ended at a trapdoor. Poirot pushed. It lifted without a sound. He found himself in the attics, a labyrinth of sloping roofs and forgotten trunks. Moonlight striped the floorboards through broken slates. Following faint scuffs in the thick dust, he moved toward the east wing, the abandoned wing where ivy choked the windows and jackdaws nested in the chimneys. At the far end, a door stood ajar. Candlelight flickered within. Poirot extinguished his torch and stepped silently inside. The room had once been a nursery. A rocking horse with 1 eye missing stood sentinel. Faded wallpaper showed Peter Rabbit in faded greens and pinks. On a child's table lay an open suitcase, half-packed, men's shirts, a passport in the name of Damien Giles Blackwood, a thick wad of banknotes, and a revolver. Damien himself stood at the window, back turned, staring out at the moon-washed park. He held the ivory miniature of his true father between finger and thumb. "You always were theatrical, Monsieur Poirot," he said without turning, "creeping about in priests' holes like a stage detective. Did you enjoy the view from inside the clock?" Poirot closed the door softly behind him. "I enjoyed the clarity, monsieur. Everything is now perfectly clear." Damien turned. His face was haggard, the habitual mockery stripped away. "Is it? Then explain this to me." He held up the miniature. "All my life I believed Reginald Blackwood was my father, cold, brutal, ashamed of me. My mother died birthing me, they said, but she didn't, did she? She was a housemaid called Clarissa Vale, who loved a man who abandoned her. And the man who raised me murdered his own twin to keep the estate." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I found the diary in the cellar when I was 16. I thought it was Reginald's confession, that he had killed Giles. I hated him for it. When he conveniently died of a heart attack, I danced on his grave. Only last year did I discover the second diary, hidden in the nursery chimney. Giles wrote it after he assumed Reginald's identity. He married Evelyn under a false name, fathered me on Clarissa in secret, then abandoned us both when the risk grew too great. 2 monsters, 1 face." He tossed the miniature onto the table. "I came back 3 months ago to claim what was mine, the estate, the title, the money. I found Clarissa still here, still faithful to a ghost. She recognized me at once, said I had my father's eyes. She gave me the letters. Together we planned to force Evelyn to acknowledge me publicly. To pay for 25 years of lies, 50,000 was only the beginning." His voice cracked. "Then tonight, I repaired the clock, yes. I wanted Evelyn to feel what Giles felt. Panic, helplessness, the pendulum descending. I set the tripwire for her. But Clarissa went to the gallery early. She wanted to leave one last letter inside the clock, proof for the police if anything went wrong. She triggered the mechanism herself." He looked at Poirot with raw anguish. "I killed the only person who ever loved me without condition, my own mother." Poirot's face was grave. "You speak the truth at last, monsieur. But there is one thing you still do not understand." He drew from his pocket the bundle of letters found in the hidden chamber. "Read the last one." Damien took it with trembling fingers. "My darling boy, if you are reading this, I am already dead. I have known for weeks that you meant to kill Evelyn tonight. I could not let you become a murderer for my sake. I have rewritten the note you saw, the one summoning the blackmailer. I will go to the gallery early and stand where the pendulum must fall. Let them think it an accident, or that the curse of the clock took me. You will be safe, and the truth will die with me. Forgive your foolish, loving mother." Clarissa Damien read it once, then again. The paper slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor like a dying moth. "She chose it?" His voice was a child's. "Oui. She sacrificed herself so that you would not hang. A mother's love. It is the one force stronger than hate." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant drip of water from broken gutters. Damien looked suddenly very young and very tired. "What happens now, Monsieur Poirot?" "Now you will come downstairs. You will confess everything to the police when they arrive. You will tell them the mechanism was an accident, that you repaired the clock as a prank, never imagining harm. The letters will remain hidden. Clarissa's last wish will be honoured. You will not hang." Damien stared. "Why would you do that for me? Because I am not the law, monsieur. I am Hercule Poirot, and sometimes justice must be tempered with mercy. Your mother paid the price you both owed." Damien bent his head. When he raised it again, the arrogance was gone. Will you stay with me when I tell them?" Poirot placed a small, immaculate hand on the young man's shoulder. "Until the end, mon fils." Together they descended the narrow attic stair, past the silent rocking horse and the ghosts of children who had never played there. Behind them, The suitcase lay open under the cold moon, the revolver untouched. In the long gallery, the great clock waited, its pendulum still, its secrets finally spent. For the first time in 20 years, it would never strike again. Chapter 8. The Clock's Midnight Secret. The house woke to a pale, exhausted dawn. Frost silvered the lawns. The flooded drive lay like a dark mirror between the griffins on the gateposts. In the long gallery, the great clock stood mute, its hands frozen at 12 minutes past 8, the exact minute Clarissa Vale had died. Poirot had not slept. At 6 he had walked the secret passage again, torch in hand, committing every inch to memory. At 7 he had taken coffee with Lady Evelyn in the morning room. She looked 20 years older than the woman who had greeted him 3 days earlier. "I have spoken with Damien," he told her quietly. "He will make a statement to the police this morning. The mechanism was a tragic prank, he will say. A boyish attempt to frighten you that went horribly wrong. There will be no mention of Giles, of twins, of hidden children. Clarissa's last letter will never see daylight." Lady Evelyn's hands trembled around her cup. "And the estate? The title? Will pass to him one day. He is the rightful heir, madame, whether the world knows it or not." She closed her eyes. Reginald, or Giles, whichever monster he was, took everything from that poor girl. At least let her son have what should have been his. Poirot inclined his head. "Mercy," he reflected, "sometimes wears a very strange face." At 9:30, Inspector Lee arrived from Chippenham, a tall, laconic man with the patient eyes of one who has seen too many country house tragedies. Damien met him in the library, white-faced but steady. Poirot stood beside him, a small, silent guarantor that the confession would be neither more nor less than the truth required. The inspector listened without interruption while Damien spoke of restoring the clock for a wager, of the tripwire meant only to ring a bell and startle Aunt Evelyn, of the unimaginable horror when Clarissa triggered it instead. Tears, genuine ones, ran down the young man's cheeks. Lee closed his notebook. "Accidental death through misadventure. I'll speak to the coroner. These old houses are full of nasty surprises." He glanced at Poirot. "Though I've never seen one quite so elaborate." Poirot permitted himself the ghost of a smile. "The English aristocracy, Inspector, has always excelled at elaborate surprises." By noon the police photographer had finished. The bodies had been removed for burial, and the household began its slow dispersal. Colonel Bannister departed for his club in London, muttering about damned bad form. Dr. and Mrs. Leland left in their Bentley without saying goodbye to anyone. Sylvia Blackwood, suddenly heiress to nothing and everything, asked Poirot in a whisper whether she might train as a nurse. He told her yes, 1,000 times yes. Only Lady Evelyn remained, standing in the hall as though turned to stone. Poirot took his leave with old-world courtesy. "You will sell the clock, I think," he suggested gently. "It leaves today," she said. "There is a dealer in Bath who specializes in difficult pieces. He has agreed to break it up for parts. The ebony will make fine piano keys, he says." Poirot bowed over her hand. Then the past truly ends. He was at the door when she called after him, almost inaudibly. "Monsieur Poirot, do you believe in forgiveness?" He paused, looking back at the tall, ravaged woman framed by the suits of armour. "I believe, madame, that some debts can only be paid forward. Your nephew will pay Clarissa's debt all his life. That is forgiveness enough." Outside, the Daimler waited. Hawkins handed Poirot into the back seat with the solemnity of a priest closing a tomb. As they swept between the griffins, Poirot glanced once more at the house. Workmen were already in the long gallery. He could hear the scrape of saws and the crash of ebony being torn apart. Somewhere in that destruction, the last bones of Giles Blackwood were being freed at last. The car turned onto the Chippenham Road. Poirot took from his pocket the bundle of letters Clarissa had meant for her son. The real letters, not the ones she had sacrificed herself to hide. He held them a moment, then opened the window and let the wind take them. They fluttered away like white birds over the frost-rimed fields. Poirot closed the window and settled back against the cushions. "Home, Hawkins," he said, "and if you please, stop in Bath. I find I have a sudden desire for a very large crème brûlée." Behind them, Blackwood Manor dwindled against the winter sky, and for the first time in 300 years, no clock ticked within its walls. In the wreckage of the long gallery, a single brass pendulum lay on the floor, its blood long cleaned away. A workman picked it up, shrugged, and tossed it onto the pile for scrap. At that exact moment, far away in London, the clock on Poirot's mantel gave one soft, satisfied chime, though it was only 2:30. Poirot smiled. "Merci, mon vieux," he murmured to the empty air. "The case is closed." Chapter 9. Twists among the little grey cells. The train from Chippenham to Paddington was almost empty. A thin December sun glinted on frost-covered fields, and the carriage smelled of coal smoke and wet wool. Hercule Poirot sat alone in a first-class compartment, gloves folded neatly on his lap, eyes half closed. To the casual observer, he appeared to be dozing. In reality, the little grey cells were conducting a furious symphony. Something was wrong. Not with the solution he had presented to Inspector Lee. That was perfect, humane, and final. Not with Damien's confession. He would keep to the agreed story. Poirot had seen the boy's soul crack open like an egg. Not even with Clarissa's sacrifice. Tragic, noble, complete. No, what disturbed Poirot was a detail so small that no one else had noticed it. Yet it rang against his sense of order, like a cracked bell. The tripwire. He took from his pocket a small envelope and emptied its contents onto the folded newspaper. 1 6-inch length of picture cord, the fatal piece he had removed from the clock himself. He turned it over and over between gloved fingers. The knot was still there, a perfect double Carrick bend. Colonel Bannister had blustered that thousands of men could tie it. True. Damien had admitted setting the trap, also true. Yet the knot was tied left-handed. Poirot had watched Damien knot his tie that very morning, right-handed, like 90% of humanity. He had watched Colonel Bannister wind his watch, light his pipe, raise his glass, all right-handed. Dr. Leland wrote prescriptions with his right hand. Beatrice Leland signed hotel registers with her right. Clarissa herself had been right-handed. Poirot had seen her clutch letters in her right fist as she died. So who in that house tied knots with the left hand? The train lurched. Poirot's eyes snapped fully open. There was one person he had never watched perform the smallest manual task. One person who had stood quietly in the background, pale, silent, forgotten, Sylvia Blackwood. He closed his fist around the cord until the edges bit into his palm. "Imbecile," he whispered to himself. "You have been dazzled by grand tragedy and maternal sacrifice, and the serpent was hiding in the grass all along." He rose, pulled the communication cord, an act so out of character that the guard almost dropped his lantern when Poirot demanded the train be stopped at the next signal box. Minutes later he was in a telephone kiosk, speaking urgently to Inspector Lee. "Delay the inquest. Do not, I repeat, do not, release the clock fragment to the dealer in Bath. And find Miss Sylvia Blackwood. She has not taken the London train, as she told her aunt. I believe she is returning to the manor. By the time the Daimler, sent post-haste by a bewildered Lady Evelyn, collected him from a country station, the little grey cells were singing a very different tune." The house looked smaller in daylight, almost embarrassed by what it had witnessed. Workmen had gone. The long gallery was stripped bare, floorboards scarred where the clock had stood for 2.5 centuries. Only a dark stain and a pile of ebony splinters remained. Lady Evelyn met him in the hall, face bloodless. "She's in the old nursery," she said before he could ask. "She came back an hour ago, locked herself in, won't answer." Poirot took the stairs 2 at a time. The nursery door was locked, but the key was on the outside, turned deliberately. He knocked once, softly. "Mademoiselle Sylvia, it is Poirot. Open, I beg you." Silence. Then the key turned from within. The door opened a crack. Sylvia's face appeared, no longer the frightened deer, but something older, colder. "You were supposed to leave," she said, "and you were supposed to be on a train to London. Instead, you returned to watch the clock destroyed. Why?" She stepped back. The room was exactly as he had left it the previous night. Suitcase still open, revolver still on the table. But now a single object lay beside the gun. The brass pendulum, rescued from the scrap pile, cleaned until it shone like gold. Sylvia's left hand, Poirot noted at once, was wrapped in a blood-stained handkerchief. "You hurt yourself," he said gently. "Splinter," she answered. "Ebony is sharp." She unwrapped the handkerchief. A deep, deliberate cut crossed the palm, fresh, but already scabbing. "I wondered when you would notice the knot," she said. "Everyone else was too busy weeping over Clarissa and poor misunderstood Damien." She laughed, a small, precise sound. "You see, Monsieur Poirot, I am Giles Blackwood's legitimate daughter, not the housemaid's bastard, the legitimate one. My mother was the Austrian countess he married in secret before the family forced an annulment. They paid her to disappear. She died in Vienna when I was 3. I was brought up in convents, then by an aunt who hated me. Last year she died and left me the marriage lines, the ring, the proof." She opened a locket at her throat. Inside was a miniature of the same dark, handsome face Poirot had seen in the ivory portrait. "I came here to claim my birthright. Quietly, legally. But Evelyn would never acknowledge a foreign Catholic girl over darling English Damien. And Damien, oh, he found the skeleton first and thought he was the wronged heir. He and Clarissa were going to bleed Evelyn dry, then expose everything. I could not allow that." Her voice never rose. It was almost conversational. "So I let them plan their little drama. I even helped Damien repair the clock. Left-handed knots are a convent habit. The nuns were very strict. I knew Clarissa would go early to leave her noble suicide note. I knew the pendulum would fall. One obstacle removed." She picked up the brass disc, weighed it in her injured hand. "Then you arrived, Monsieur Poirot, and nearly ruined everything with your mercy. Letting Damien take the blame, burying the past. I couldn't let the clock be broken up without retrieving this." She caressed the pendulum almost lovingly. "It killed my father. It killed the woman who tried to steal my place. One day, when I am Lady Blackwood, and this house is mine, I will hang it in the hall as a memorial. People will think it charmingly eccentric." Poirot studied her with profound sadness. "And the revolver, mademoiselle?" Her smile was suddenly very young, very tired. For me, after I have finished what I came to do." She glanced toward the door. Lady Evelyn stood there, face blank with shock. Sylvia raised the pendulum like a priest raising a chalice. "Goodbye, Aunt. You should have read the letters I sent from Austria. You would have known who I was." She turned the revolver toward her own heart. Poirot moved faster than a man of his size had any right to. His hand closed over the barrel. "Non, mademoiselle, you will not escape justice so neatly." For a moment they struggled. Small, neat Belgian against desperate girl. The revolver roared. Plaster exploded from the ceiling. When Inspector Lee arrived 20 minutes later, Sylvia Blackwood sat handcuffed to the rocking horse, weeping silently. The pendulum lay on the floor between them, gleaming, untouchable, waiting for whatever court would decide its fate. Poirot lit a small cigar and watched the smoke curl toward the nursery ceiling, where faded rabbits still chased faded cabbages. "3 deaths were planned behind that clock," he said to Lee. 2 occurred. The 3rd was prevented. It is an acceptable average. He did not sound as though he believed it. Outside, the frost began to melt. Somewhere in the attics, a loose slate shifted and fell with a clatter like a single final chime. Chapter 10. The final chime of Justice Blackwood Manor, 3 weeks later. The sky was the colour of wet, echte slate. But the wind had shifted to the south and carried the first faint promise of spring. The long gallery was empty now. No clock, no bloodstain, only pale rectangles on the panelling where ancestral portraits had been removed to pay debts. The house itself was for sale. The estate agent's board already stood between the griffins, discreetly worded, "A distinguished Jacobean residence of exceptional character." Hercule Poirot walked the gravel sweep one last time, overcoat buttoned to the throat, Homburg set at the precise angle that had defied 2 decades of English weather. Beside him walked Lady Evelyn Blackwood, thinner, straighter, dressed in travelling black. At the foot of the main steps waited 2 cars. One, a Rolls-Royce Phantom, would take her to Southampton, and the Cunard liner that sailed for Cape Town at noon tomorrow. The other, the familiar Daimler, waited for Poirot. They paused. "You have been more than kind, monsieur," she said quietly, "to shield the family name, to spare Damien the worst of it, to give me a way to leave this place without disgrace." Poirot inclined his head. "Disgrace belongs to the house, madame, not to you. You were deceived before you ever set foot here as a bride." She looked up at the blind windows. "I keep thinking I hear the clock," she whispered, "even though it is gone." Poirot understood. Some sounds once heard never leave the bones. A third figure appeared in the doorway. Damien, pale, chastened, the arrogance leached out of him. He carried a small leather jewel case. "Aunt Evelyn." His voice was steady but low. "I want you to have these." He opened the case. Inside lay the Blackwood pearls, 3 ropes luminous as moonlight. "They were never entailed. They were yours by right. Take them. Begin again." She touched the pearls with one gloved finger, then closed the lid and pressed the case back into his hands. "Keep them for your wife one day, Damien. Whoever she may be, she will need something beautiful to remind her that even cursed families can produce gentleness." She kissed his cheek, a dry, fleeting benediction, then turned to Poirot. "And you, monsieur? Back to London, and the next impossible crime?" "Back to order, madame, to symmetry, to the little grey cells." A brief silence. "Tell me one thing," she said suddenly. "If Sylvia had not tried to take her own life, if she had stood trial, would she have hanged?" Poirot considered. The English winter wind stirred the dead leaves around their feet. Perhaps, perhaps not. Juries are strangely moved by beautiful young women who murder for love of a father they never knew. But justice, madame, is not always the rope. Sometimes it is living with what one has done. He glanced toward the second car. Inspector Lee leaned against the bonnet, pretending not to watch. Sylvia Blackwood pleaded guilty at the assizes yesterday. The judge, moved, I suspect, by her youth and by certain letters I placed before him, sentenced her to be detained during His Majesty's pleasure. She will spend some years in a sanatorium in the Lake District. There are worse prisons and better cures. Lady Overlyn nodded slowly, as though a weight had slipped from her shoulders. "Then it is finished." "Finished," Poirot echoed. They shook hands, formally, correctly. She entered the rolls. The chauffeur closed the door with the soft finality of a coffin lid. The car moved off between the griffins and did not look back. Damien remained on the steps. "I'm selling everything," he said. "The house, the land, the remaining pictures. The debts will be paid. What's left I'll use to set up a trust. For children born out of wedlock, the ones the grand families pretend don't exist. Clarissa's name will be on the Charterstone, not mine." Poirot permitted himself a small, approving smile. "You have learned quickly, mon ami. That is good." Damien hesitated. "Will I ever be clean?" Poirot looked at him for a long moment. "None of us is clean, monsieur. We only decide each morning whether we will add to the dirt or begin in some small way to sweep it away." He climbed into the Daimler. Hawkins closed the door. As they rolled down the drive, Poirot caught a last glimpse of the house. Empty windows, ivy already reclaiming the stone. A removal van stood in the yard. Workmen were carrying out the shattered remnants of the great clock wrapped in sacking. One piece, the brass pendulum, slipped free and rang once, brightly, against the gravel before a man retrieved it. The sound followed the car all the way to the gates, a single, clear chime, neither mournful nor triumphant, simply final. Poirot leaned back against the leather. "Eh bien," he said to the winter landscape sliding past, "another tragedy concluded, another order restored." He took from his pocket a small object wrapped in silk, the Queen of Spades, the card that had been slashed and bloodied 3 weeks earlier. Someone, a conscientious housemaid perhaps, had cleaned and pressed it. The slash was still there, but the blood was gone. Poirot turned the card over. On the back, in Sylvia Blackwood's neat convent hand, someone had written a single line in violet ink. "Thank you for letting me pay the debt myself." He read it once, then let the wind streaming past the window take the card. It fluttered away over the hedgerows like a dark butterfly, vanishing among the waking fields. In London that evening, Poirot dined alone at his favourite table in a quiet restaurant off Piccadilly. He ordered crêpe Suzette, a half-bottle of 1914 Veuve Clicquot, and for once allowed himself a second cigar. When the waiter asked if monsieur required anything else, Poirot smiled. "Only silence, mon brave. A little silence after the chimes." Outside, Big Ben struck 8. The notes rolled across the city, deep, measured, unhurried. Poirot raised his tipped glass to the empty chair opposite. "À la vôtre," he murmured. "To absent friends, to mothers who paid impossible prices, to daughters who tried to balance scales that were never meant for human hands." He drank. Somewhere far south, a liner left Southampton Water, bound for Table Mountain and a new continent. Somewhere north, in a quiet room overlooking Windermere, a girl with violet eyes began to learn how to live with the sound a pendulum makes when it finally stops. And in a dusty saleroom in Bath, a brass disc that had once measured out 2 deaths and 1 redemption was sold for 18 shillings to a dealer who never knew its history. Order of a kind had been restored. The little grey cells were content. Poirot paid the bill, adjusted his hat, and stepped out into the London night, where the fog was lifting and the first star of evening pricked the dark above Regent Street. Another case closed. Another chime silent